Come with me. A millionaire found a poor little girl sleeping under the freezing sky at a bus stop. His next action changed their lives forever. Late winter in New York exhaled a chill. A light crust of snow clung to the pavement and to car hoods in a hazy white film. Wind gusted through the bare trees and made the streetlights tremble. Brandon Ellis slowed at the intersection, his hands long accustomed to the feel of the wheel since the day he had to do everything alone. 2 years earlier, his wife had died of illness. And since then, the house had held only his footsteps and those of his 5-year-old daughter, Sophie. Known as the youngest CEO to dominate Wall Street, he had built his tech empire on precision, numbers, and an almost total emotional remove. Yet every night he reminded himself to lower his voice, to speak gently when he spoke to his child. In the car, Sophie sat in the back seat hugging a stuffed bear, now and then pressing her forehead to the window to watch the snowflakes drift by. He was about to merge onto the highway, but the brake lights ahead flared red, and his car shuddered to a stop. At the bus stop, where the streetlight fell in a dim halo, a small figure lay curled on a damp sheet of cardboard like a leaf drawn tight against the cold. Sophie leaned forward a little, clutching her bear tighter, then said, "Dad, by the bench at that bus stop, I think there's a little girl who isn't moving." Brandon checked the mirror, cracked the window, and the wind knifed in, cold enough to touch the back of his neck. He turned back and spoke slowly so she would catch every word. "Stay in the car, lock the doors, and do not open them unless you hear my voice." Sophie nodded, pressed the lock button, the latch clicking softly. She pressed her lips together, afraid, but kept looking outside. "Dad, don't leave her there. It's so cold out." Brandon flipped on the hazards, then pushed the door open and stepped out. He approached the bus stop and crouched so his eyes were level with the child's. He didn't touch her, keeping just enough distance so she would know she could pull back if she was afraid. "It's too cold out here. Let me help." Her small body twitched, her eyelids flickering open and closed as if afraid of the light. Her lips purpled by the cold. Brandon slowly unfastened his coat, lifted it like a blanket, then draped it over her shoulders with movements that were clear and measured. "I'm just covering you to keep you warm. Then I'll step back. Are you okay?" Her eyes lifted, not fully conscious, yet still aware enough to recognize something safe in his voice. She didn't answer, only looked past the man toward the black car, where a small face was pressed to the glass. Sophie was waving very slightly, as if afraid to startle her. Brandon tilted his head so she could see it. "That little one is my daughter. She's worried about you. She wants you to be warm." She pressed her lips together, her voice hoarse from the cold and from fear. "Can I go anywhere?" Brandon kept his gaze steady. "Come with me," he said softly. "I'll take you somewhere warmer, with lights and blankets, where you can still see the sky through the window." He waited for a slight nod, as if for permission. When she tilted her head, Brandon slipped his arm through the coat and lifted her, careful as if he were holding something fragile. The right rear door swung open, and warmth poured out of the car like a greeting. Sophie quickly pushed her teddy bear aside to make space, shifting closer against the seat, her tone surprisingly serious for a 5-year-old. "Daddy, I locked the door already." "Sister, sit here. This bear is really warm." She pulled the seatbelt out, holding one side ready for the newcomer. "I'll sit still and not talk loudly. Don't be afraid, okay?" The sound of the automatic lock clicked when Brandon closed the door. He walked around to the driver's seat, glanced into the mirror to make sure the seatbelt was buckled, then started the engine. Sophie placed her small hand on the edge of the coat, wrapped around the girl's body. She didn't touch skin, only fabric, as if she already understood that even a touch could scare someone. "What's your name?" Silence stretched, thin as a thread. "My name is Emma." "I'm Sophie. If you're scared, you can hold my hand, or you can hold the bear. I won't be upset." Emma didn't take her hand. She pulled the coat tighter across her chest, her eyes following Brandon through the mirror, as though she needed to see the one holding the wheel to feel direction. Brandon caught that look and gave a small nod. a promise unspoken. The car rolled away from the curb. Yellow streetlights swept over the thin layer of snow, drawing long tree shadows across the asphalt. Brandon kept the wheel steady, his thoughts about tomorrow's meetings fading into haze. Numbers, usually so obedient, slipped away now like breath on glass. He didn't ask where she came from or why she was there. He only raised the temperature a little higher and turned the heater vent slightly toward the back seat. "Do you feel warmer now?" he asked, without expecting an answer. Sophie pulled a thin blanket from behind her and laid it gently across Emma's lap, then drew her hand back quickly, afraid of startling her. "If you like stories, I can tell you about the mint milkshake. It warms your mouth first, then your stomach after." Emma's lips moved. A faint smile flickered across her face, brief as the crossing beams of headlights on the road. The city slid past the windows in long streaks, while inside the car there was only the hum of the heater and the rhythm of breathing. Brandon held the wheel straight, slowing more than usual at each yellow light so the girl in the back wouldn't be jolted. In the mirror, Emma's eyelids grew heavy. She leaned into the seat, her lips shaping two broken words, a reflex drawn from memory. "Don't leave." Brandon heard it clearly, though she hadn't meant to speak to anyone. He didn't look back into the mirror. He looked at the road ahead. His voice was low but firm, carrying through the warmth and settling in the back seat, like a hand placed in just the right spot. "No one is leaving you." The garage door opened, and the car backed in. Brandon turned off the engine and looked into the back seat. "Sophie, turn the heater up one notch. I'll carry Emma inside. Lock the door, then follow me." The little girl nodded and pressed the lock. Brandon pulled his coat up to cover Emma's head, then stepped quickly through the side entrance near the living room. The front door swung open. Jacob stood there, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a zipped-up security uniform coat. His eyes steady, with the calm of someone used to handling sudden situations. He stepped aside, lowered his voice, and greeted him. "Good evening, sir. Do you need me to help with anything?" Brandon shook his head. "Thank you, Jacob. Everything is fine." Sandra appeared right behind Jacob. She was about 50, neat, her hair pulled tightly into a bun, a faint perfume trailing around her. She crossed her arms, looked at the child in Brandon's arms, then spoke quietly as though reminding him. "Sir, if this gets out, it won't look good. It could affect your reputation." "Who is this little girl?" Brandon calmly set Emma down on the bench in the hall and pulled a thin blanket over her. "Her name is Emma." Sandra pressed her lips together. "Sir, this house isn't an orphanage. Not everything can just be taken in here. That girl is only pretending to be pitiful so you'll take pity on her." Brandon looked straight into her eyes. "This is my house. Whoever I want to bring in is my decision. From now on, there will be a new rule in this house. No one is to refer to a guest as this thing or that thing." Sophie ran up, hugging a teddy bear to her chest, stopped one step away from Emma, then sat down on the rug. "Emma, this bear is really warm." She laid the bear next to her and pulled the blanket tighter around her. "I'll sit here. I won't be noisy." Brandon signaled to Jacob, "Bring me the tray." A few minutes later, a small tray was set on the low table. Warm water, a cotton towel, a pair of soft wool socks. Brandon knelt on one knee, slid the tray toward Emma. "Have a little water to warm up. If you want, you can wipe your hands first." He didn't touch her but stepped back 2 paces, leaving enough open air between them. In the kitchen, a bowl of chicken soup was heating. Brandon carried it out and set it nearby, the steam carrying a hint of ginger. "Here's some soup. You don't have to eat right away." Emma sat still, her eyes following his hands instead of the bowl. After a while, she picked up the towel and wiped her purpled fingers, her movements slow but deliberate. Brandon kept his voice steady. "Do it whichever way feels right for you." She gave a very small nod, like a signal that it was safe. Sandra was still standing with her arms crossed at the kitchen threshold, her eyebrows slightly raised when she saw Emma glancing around as though looking for an exit. Sophie leaned closer, her voice small but clear. Emma, if your feet are cold, I have wool socks. Emma pulled her feet back, shook her head slightly. I can do it myself. She dragged the towel down to her feet and wiped them quickly, as if afraid someone would change their mind. Brandon didn't interfere. He only turned to Jacob. Leave an extra blanket on the armrest. Emma reached for a small piece of bread from the tray, glanced around quickly, then hid it in her coat pocket. Sandra noticed, the corner of her mouth curling, her eyes showing disapproval. Brandon pretended not to see. He stood up, opened the cupboard next to the kitchen, pulled out an empty drawer, and labeled it with a marker. This drawer is Emma's personal supply. Everyone has the right to their own space. He placed 2 small packs of cookies and a carton of milk inside, then closed it. Emma froze, her eyes wide as if she couldn't believe what she had just heard. Sophie giggled softly. That's great. You have your own drawer. The air softened. Brandon pushed the bowl of soup a little closer, still without insisting. Emma looked at the bowl once more, then took a small sip. Her throat swallowed with effort, but clearly, her eyes less clouded. Sophie rested her chin on her hand, watching over her like a little gatekeeper. Is it good, sis? Emma answered softly. It's good, warm. Jacob stepped back. But before leaving, he placed a warm water bottle gently beside the chair. If you want to hold it to warm your hands, you can hold this. He smiled with his eyes. Emma looked at the bottle for a moment, then hugged it to her chest. Before bedtime, Brandon tidied up the living room. He dimmed most of the lights, leaving only the warm yellow glow from the ceiling. Emma curled up in the blanket, eyes gazing at the ceiling as if looking at the sky through another window. Brandon sat down in the chair across from her, keeping a distance enough so she wouldn't feel cornered. There are no tests here. If you want to talk, you talk. If not, that's fine. But there will be an appointment tomorrow to check your health. Just talking. Emma did not look at him, only asked into the empty air. Talking. Does it hurt? Number? If any question makes you uncomfortable, we stop right away. Sophie brought a small pillow, placing it next to the leg of the couch. Dad, tonight Emma sleeps in my room. Brandon patted her head. Good, but Dad will sit here for a while. He pulled the armchair closer to the wall, placing a glass of water on the low table within Emma's reach. Go to sleep. If you're thirsty at midnight, the glass is here. Sandra walked by, stopping as if wanting to say something more. Then let it go. She straightened the tablecloth neatly, then disappeared into the kitchen. Jacob locked the gate, turned off the yard light, and winked at Brandon as a wordless reassurance. I'll be on watch at the door. At midnight, the hallway was silent. Small footsteps sounded. Then Sophie's bedroom door opened a crack. The little girl poked her head out, whispering, Dad, she's crying but not making a sound. Brandon stood up immediately, not turning on the main light, only switching on the reading lamp for a soft glow. Emma lay on her side, her shoulder trembling in steady rhythm, her hand gripping the edge of the blanket until her knuckles whitened. Brandon came closer, not touching her. He only placed the glass of water on the table, pulled the blanket higher over her, then sat down in the chair, letting the sound of the chair touch the carpet as gently as possible. Go back to sleep, Sophie. Dad's watching. Sophie stood in the doorway, hugging her pillow to her chest, nodding. Yes, Dad. She closed her bedroom door, leaving a small gap for the light. Brandon looked at the wall clock ticking evenly. He whispered as if reminding himself, tomorrow morning, our home will have the second rule. Emma did not answer, but the trembling in her shoulders slowed, then stilled, as if his words had passed through the blanket, through her skin, and settled somewhere near her heart. The morning opened with the scent of hot tea and the warmth of the heater. Brandon set a simple table. A bowl of warm chicken soup and a plate of sliced bread, placed just slightly out of reach, so Emma would not feel pressured. She sat on the armchair near the window, her eyes following his hand as he poured the tea. Each drop that fell sounded as clear as a slow breath after a long night. Sophie sat beside her, hugging her teddy bear, legs swinging but without making noise. Brandon pulled out the chair across from them, keeping just enough distance for Emma to feel safe. He spoke slowly, giving each word its own place. The second rule in this house is we do not hurt each other's memories. If anyone shows signs of fear, the other one stops. Emma did not lift her head but nodded very slightly. Sophie looked over, immediately echoing the idea with an action. She slid the spoon a bit farther from Emma's bowl of soup and pulled it closer to herself, as if to say that everyone had the right to choose their own rhythm. The doorbell rang. Jacob spoke from the hallway, his voice warm and low. "The doctor is here." Dr. Leah Simmons entered with a canvas bag and a gentle smile. She was in her 30s, a child psychologist who had worked with traumatized children, so her voice was always slow and clear. She greeted Sophie first, bending down to her level. "Hello, sweetheart." Then she turned to Emma. "Hello, dear." Brandon did not give a long introduction. He only said enough. "This is Dr. Leah. She will help us find better ways to breathe." Leah did not ask why Emma was there. She asked what Emma could choose. "Would you like to talk in the living room or in the backyard?" Emma answered softly, as if afraid of breaking a thread. "A room with a window." Leah nodded right away. Yes. She chose the armchair near the window, opened her bag, and took out a soft rubber ball and a piece of velvet cloth. "Today we are only looking for a safe spot. When your heart beats fast, you look at the sky for a moment, touch something soft, and then take 3 breaths." She placed the ball in front of Emma, without touching her hand. "Try squeezing it lightly, then let go." The exercise took place in silence. Sophie sat on the rug, scribbling a few window frames with colored pencils. When Emma's breathing became steadier, Sophie pushed the box of pencils closer. "Emma, let's draw together. If you don't like the sky, we can draw an open door." Emma looked at the paper and asked softly as if it were a secret, "Does the door have a lock?" "Yes, and I'll keep the key." Sophie answered immediately, her voice firm like a small promise. Emma touched the pencil tip to the page and drew a thin door frame. The first lines trembled, then slowly straightened. In the kitchen, the sound of running water and a spoon tapping against porcelain carried over. Sandra was washing her hands while muttering to Jacob, her eyes never leaving the window frame of the living room. "The boss keeps softening like that. If the press shows up tomorrow and finds out, it will be a big problem." Jacob dried his hands and replied calmly, "My job is to keep this house at peace." Sandra gave a quick glance, then secretly pulled out her phone, raising it toward Emma. Jacob immediately blocked her hand. "Don't do that." Brandon appeared behind them, his voice not raised but leaving no room for negotiation. "The phone." Sandra froze, trying to force a half smile. "I care about your image, sir." Brandon took the phone, placed it face down on the table. "I care that children are not exposed." Sandra bit her lip and stayed silent. Jacob stood still between the kitchen and the living room like a living door, blocking every unnecessary gaze. Near noon, the doorbell rang again. Jacob went out to check, then came back holding a crumpled envelope stuck in the fence. He handed it to Brandon, his eyes briefly heavy. Inside the envelope was a small slip of paper. The handwriting rushed and crooked. "She belongs to me." Brandon read it once, folded it, and passed it to Jacob. "File it, lock the drawer." He did not tell Emma, nor did he let his breathing change. When he stepped back into the living room, he saw Emma finishing the drawing of a door handle. The tiny curve sat neatly inside a square. Brandon did not intrude. He only pulled the curtain slightly higher so the light would stay warm, then went to make a fresh pot of tea. In the afternoon, Leah scheduled a short break before wrapping up. She did not give a long summary. She only looked at Brandon and reminded him, Don't promise things you can't be sure of. For a child like this, forever is a very heavy word. Promise tonight, because tonight is their whole world. Brandon nodded, his eyes resting for a moment on the rubber ball Emma still held. Tonight. Leah turned to the two children and smiled. Tomorrow, if you want, we can look at the sky from another window. The daylight faded. Sandra asked to leave early, her voice dry. I have things to do. Brandon did not stop her. He only told Jacob to change the door code and check the cameras again. Sophie gathered the crayons and made a small paper label to stick on the box. Emma's door box. Emma looked at the label, then whispered, "Thank you." The two girls sat on the rug, drawing together a small window pane on the door, as if to let light in without being too bright. At night, the house grew quiet. Only the steady breath of the fireplace remained. Brandon walked past the living room before dimming the lights. Emma looked up, her eyes less red now, her voice very small but clear. "Daddy, are you going anywhere?" Brandon stood at the doorway, answered at once, so the silence would not turn into worry. "Tonight, no." Emma closed her eyes, her hand still holding the soft ball, her breathing even like an unspoken story. Brandon took out his phone to switch it to silent mode. The screen lit up in the golden dimness. A message from an unknown number appeared like a shadow falling on the floor. "Tomorrow, we talk about price." He looked at it for a second, then shut the screen off and slid it back into his pocket. He would not let a ringtone break the rhythm of breath in the room. He only pulled the armchair closer, sat down long enough for Emma to know that tonight, the house still had someone keeping watch. In the morning, Brandon drove Emma to the psychology clinic in Midtown. The hallway was brightly lit, with fabric-covered waiting chairs and a few children's drawings hung on the walls. A man walked by, leaving behind a faint trace of cigarette smoke. Emma stopped right in front of the door, her hand clutching the edge of her coat, her eyes empty as if someone had drained all sound from around her. Brandon crouched down to her eye level, his voice low and steady. "Look at my hand. 1, 2, 3. Breathe with me." He opened his hand and then closed it again in a steady rhythm. Emma fixed her gaze on his knuckles, followed along, her shoulders dropping little by little. The trembling eased, like a gust of wind that had already passed. Dr. Leah Simmons stood at the doorway, watching. She gave a small nod. "Very good. You brought yourself back to a safe place." Her tone was as warm as the night before, never pushing. During the session, Leah used only short breathing exercises and soft objects. Emma touched the rubber ball, looked out the rectangular window, counted 3 breaths and stopped. No one asked why she feared the smell of smoke, and no one asked about the nights she spent outside on the street. Leah wrote down very little, only marking that the safety support skill could now be used when anxiety was triggered. While Emma was coloring the outline of the window with crayons on the small table, Brandon sat in a chair outside and pulled out his phone. He drafted an email to Lucy Graham, a family lawyer Jacob had once recommended. Lucy was around 30, straightforward, never made many promises, handled difficult adoption and guardianship cases, and sometimes worked pro bono. The subject line was short: inquiry about temporary guardianship process. He didn't write the child's name, only asked about the necessary steps and which medical documents should be requested. After hitting send, he slipped the phone into his pocket and glanced through the glass again. Emma was drawing another small window pane to the left of the frame, her hand steadier now. At noon, they left the clinic. On the way home, Brandon stopped to pick up a few simple groceries, steering clear of food stalls with smoke grills. Emma hugged the box of crayons, sitting close to the car window. As they neared the house, Jacob called to say the gate was already open. Just as the car engine went quiet, Brandon noticed a black sedan parked across the street from the gate. A man stepped out, wearing a worn coat, his eyes bloodshot like he hadn't slept in days. His stance wavering somewhere between aggression and exhaustion. He stared directly at the gate camera and rang the bell without hesitation. Jacob came out, keeping his distance by protocol. The man raised his voice so the microphone could catch it clearly. "I am Frank Carter. I came to take my daughter home." The name dropped into the courtyard like a block of ice. In the car, Brandon laid a hand on Emma's shoulder, not gripping, just a signal that meant, "Wait. Stay in the car, lock the doors. I'll handle this and be right back." He walked to the gate, stood behind the fence, his hand resting on the latch but not opening it. His voice was calm and steady. "There are laws here. If you want to see the child, follow the proper process." Frank gave a thin, crooked smile. "My law is that my kid goes with me. And you? How much do you want?" Brandon stared back, unblinking. There isn't a number in the world that can buy a child. Sandra stepped out from the foyer, clutching her planner, trying to keep her voice neutral. "If he's the biological father wanting to see her, maybe we should." Brandon didn't turn his head. He only spoke to Jacob. "Bring Sandra inside." His tone wasn't raised, but it was as firm as a locked door. Jacob caught the meaning, signaling Sandra to step back. She hesitated, then turned on her heels, sneaking a glance at the black sedan. Frank leaned on the fence with both hands, his breath thick with stale alcohol. He lowered his voice so only Brandon could hear, but the microphone still picked it up. "Tomorrow, the headlines will call you a kidnapper. Give her back to me, or pay up." Brandon neither flinched nor stepped back. "Tomorrow, I'll call the police if you're still here." Frank snorted, pulled a torn business card from his coat pocket, and tossed it onto the walkway like throwing a bone. "I'll be nearby tonight. Think it over." Brandon picked up the card without looking at it and handed it to Jacob. "Keep it." Then he closed the gate, the sound of the lock sliding into place sharp and final. The yard grew quiet again, leaving only the rustle of dry leaves on the steps. He walked back inside, pushing open the foyer door. At the end of the hallway, Emma was standing there, hands clutching the hem of her shirt, eyes fixed on the doorknob that still quivered from the forceful shut. She didn't run forward or step back. She only asked, her voice so small it could only be heard up close. "If he's my dad, do I have to go with him?" Brandon stopped one step away, leaving enough space for her to breathe. He didn't answer right away. He lowered his head to her eye level, making sure she saw his lips move, making sure each word reached her slowly and clearly. "There are laws here, and there is you. No one takes you away with threats or money. If anyone wants to see you, they have to do it the right way. And tonight, you are home." Emma swallowed hard. "Are you going anywhere?" Brandon shook his head. "Not tonight." Emma still stared at the doorknob, as if footsteps lingered beyond it. Brandon deliberately shifted her attention. "Where would you like to keep your pencil box? I'll make you a shelf higher up." Emma turned her head, her eyes drifting away from the metal handle. "By the window." Brandon nodded. "Yes, by the window." He signaled Jacob to lock the gate controls and switch the outside cameras to 24-hour storage. He sent a message to Lucy. "Someone claiming to be the biological father showed up. I'll need guidance on a no-contact order if necessary." Then he slipped his phone back into his pocket and returned to the child still clutching her shirt. "Would you like some water?" Brandon placed a warm glass within her reach, still careful not to touch her. Emma held the glass with both hands and took a small sip. Her throat eased a little. She glanced out the window, where the oak tree stood still. No black sedan in sight. "Sir." "Yes." "Is the door locked?" Brandon looked straight into her eyes. "Yes, and the key is inside." She nodded softly, as if placing the first brick of her own foundation. The morning after the encounter at the gate, the doorbell rang urgently, like someone pounding straight into the chest. Brandon opened it and saw 2 police officers standing on the porch. The woman was about 30. Her name tag read Patel, her voice soft and precise. The man looked about 40, name tag read, calm in demeanor. Officer Patel spoke briefly. "We received an anonymous call requesting a welfare check for a little girl in the house. We're only here to verify her safety, not to intervene excessively. Brandon avoided showing them around the entire place. He invited them into the living area. The kitchen door left half closed to keep privacy. She's having breakfast. If she doesn't want to meet, we'll let the doctor confirm. On the rug, Emma sat near the window as she usually did. Doctor. Leah Simmons had arrived early for the monitoring session. She lifted her eyes to Emma, giving a slight nod as if passing authority. You have the right to say no. Or just 1 minute. Emma pressed her lips together. 1 minute. Officer Reed kept his distance by the armchair, lowering his gaze so as not to create pressure. Hi there. I'm Reed. This is Officer Patel. We're not going to ask you anything scary. We just need to know you're okay. Emma gave the tiniest nod. Her hand trembled as she held the spoon. The old bruise on her wrist had faded but was still visible under the light. Officer Patel took notes. Her tone slow and warm as if reading out reassurance. Observed that the child has food, has a caregiver. A psychologist is present. No immediate signs of neglect. Leah stepped in when Emma turned to her for help. That's 1 minute. You can stop now. The phone on the table buzzed. Brandon looked at the screen. The name Lily Knox lit up. A lifestyle reporter known for sensational headlines. He pressed speakerphone to keep everything transparent. Hello. Lily's voice slid like silk. Mr. Ellis, rumor has it you're keeping a little girl illegally. Care to comment? Brandon's rhythm didn't falter. Yes. I'll comment in writing to the proper authorities. Lily tried to set a trap. Just 1 line. Brandon replied instantly. 1 line. Children are not merchandise. He tapped end, setting the phone back to silence without another word. At the staircase, a boy stood pressed behind the wooden post, thin-faced with brown eyes like Sandra's. Ethan Blake, 12 years old, quiet and prone to lowering his head when adults stared too long. He waited until the officers left before carefully pulling Brandon to the hallway corner. His cold, sweaty hand shoving in a folded piece of paper. Sir, last night Mom called a man named Frank. I heard gate code. I'm sorry. Brandon bent down to eye level, looking straight at him, so the boy wouldn't carry guilt that belonged to adults. You are not at fault. He snapped a picture of the system codes and sent it to Jacob, changed all the passwords, and simultaneously disabled Sandra's phone from accessing the smart home system. Thank you for telling the truth. Brandon called Sandra into his office. She appeared clutching her planner tightly against her chest, her face holding a strained calm. Brandon didn't waste time. You are suspended effective today. The reason, violation of a child's privacy. Sandra let out a dry laugh. You will regret this. That child will drag you down. Brandon leaned back in his chair for a moment, then sat upright, his voice steady as if sealing a coffin. I can swim. She pressed her lips together and turned away. Ethan stood at the door, his eyes shining with both worry and relief. Brandon spoke loud enough for him to hear. Go back to your room. Everything here is for the adults to handle. At noon, Leah stayed for another 20 minutes, until Emma's breathing was steady. She used only an old exercise, touching the soft ball, then looking out the window, counting 3 breaths. Without bringing up that morning's events, before leaving the house, she spoke quickly to Brandon in the foyer. If you need a written statement confirming the trauma condition and the current level of safety, I'll prepare it. But remember, don't promise distant things. Promise 1 night at a time. That's enough. Brandon nodded. That sentence had become the wooden beam holding up the entire house. As the afternoon faded, the house grew quieter after a day filled with knocks at the door. Brandon set the dinner table, letting Emma choose her own seat and serve herself. Sophie pulled her chair close to her, not touching her hand but placing a tissue by the edge of her plate. Do you like the salt on the left or the right? I'll switch it for you. Emma thought for a moment, then pointed to the left, like a small exercise in control. The meal carried few words, but not so few that it felt cold. just enough to create rhythm. After dinner, Brandon checked the security system once more, adding another filter for unknown numbers to the landline. He stopped by Ethan's room, where the boy was sitting over his homework. "If you need to stay with your aunt tonight, I'll ask Jacob to take you." Ethan shook his head. "I'm fine. I just don't want Mom to be arrested because I spoke up." Brandon placed a small box of cookies on the desk. "You spoke up because it was right. The rest is for the adults to handle." That night, Sophie stood at the threshold of the living room, hugging a pillow to her chest. "Dad, I'm sorry for being scared of the police this morning." Brandon pulled her in for a short hug, patting a steady rhythm on her back. "Being scared is normal, but you didn't run away." Sophie nodded, stepped back, and walked around the sofa, not looking directly so Emma wouldn't feel uncomfortable. "If you can't sleep, you can listen to me count from 1 to 100. Emma lay under the blanket, eyes open, not answering but not turning away. Sophie began, her voice slow and steady like the hum of a heater. 1, 2, 3, 4. Brandon dimmed the hallway lights, leaving a warm golden glow in the living room. He sat back in the armchair, making sure Emma could see there was always someone keeping watch. When Sophie reached 11, Emma murmured softly under the blanket, her voice hoarse but clearly directed. "Uncle, don't turn off the light." Brandon froze for half a beat, then replied immediately, not correcting her word, not weighing down the moment. "I won't turn it off." Sophie kept counting, slower now, as if weaving another thin thread around the blanket. Brandon's phone buzzed on the table, the screen showing a new email from Lucy Graham. The subject line was sharp and neat like a command. "Initiate temporary guardianship proceedings. Evidence required." Brandon opened the message and saw the list of documents: Leah's medical notes, photos of living conditions, the police report from that morning, and a contact log if threats occurred. He closed the laptop and looked toward the sofa. Emma's breathing had evened out after the counting, and the light remained steady, like a hand resting on her shoulder, speaking without touch that tonight someone was staying. In the morning, Brandon's phone buzzed nonstop the moment he drew the curtains. A new message from Lucy lit up on the screen, short and clear. "Stay calm. We respond through official channels." Brandon read it once more, then slipped the phone into his pocket. He called Jacob out to the foyer, his voice steady and concise. "If anyone asks, our house says one thing. Children are not merchandise. And we don't speak to reporters at the gate." Jacob nodded, switching on an extra camera on the porch. On the staircase, Ethan stood pressed against the railing. From the laundry room came Sandra's whisper into her phone, words falling like shards of glass. "Frank, I have photos. How much will you pay?" He swallowed hard, his face flickering with unease. Brandon caught his reflection in the mirror, raised a hand gently to signal him to wait, and didn't call his name so he wouldn't startle. When it was time for school, Brandon walked Emma into the yard. The school gate buzzed like a crowded nest. One parent clicked her tongue as she glanced over. "So, the rumor's true," another answered in a low voice. "The girl comes from the streets." Emma paused for half a beat. Brandon crouched quickly, speaking just loud enough for her to hear. "You walk your own path. I'm right here." She nodded, almost imperceptibly. Her homeroom teacher, Miss Karen Monroe, stood firm at the classroom entrance, slender frame and direct gaze, known for fairness and patience. She took half a step forward. "She's my student." Her voice was calm, neither raised nor soft, but decisive enough to make the whispers drop to the floor. Inside the classroom, Jordan Wells slid out the chair beside him, his hands still dusted with chalk. "Sit here." Emma hesitated, her eyes flicking toward the window where Brandon stood. He raised his thumb, then stepped back from the frame, so as not to intrude on her space. During class, Miss Monroe assigned a simple logic problem with a hidden trap. Emma read it, solved it quickly, then stopped, erased her work, and rewrote a different path. Miss Monroe approached, placing her hand on the desk without touching the notebook. Why did you change it? Emma answered softly, like the wind. I wanted my way not to make anyone lose. The entire class fell silent for a beat. Then pencils began to move all at once, as if every child wanted to try a new path that left fewer behind. At lunchtime, Brandon sat on a stone bench outside, watching from a distance. He didn't call her out to meet him, only passed Miss Monroe his phone number for emergencies. Emma ate slowly, while Jordan talked about how his toaster always burned the edges of bread at home. Olivia nodded beside them, now and then pushing the milk carton closer to Emma. Small gestures like that were enough for Emma to realize she was sitting inside a circle that wasn't drawn too tight. In the afternoon, reporter Lily Knox's article appeared on the local news site with a sharp headline. Millionaire suspected of hiding a minor. The photo had been cropped to show only Brandon's hand pulling the car door, while the part with Emma stepping out was cut, making it look like a scene of coercion. Brandon's phone vibrated. Lucy was calling, her voice crisp and firm. Do not respond. The less, the better. All replies go through the legal file. Brandon answered with a single word. Understood. That evening, Dr. Leah stopped by for 15 minutes. She did not bring up the article. She let Emma stand near the half-open window and guided her through a small ritual. 3 breaths. 3 words. The first word is enough. The second is safe. The third is here. Emma repeated softly, like a thread tied around her hand. Enough. Safe. Here. Brandon stood behind her, not interfering. When it ended, Leah looked at him. When the tension rises, we hold the space, not the child. Ethan rang the office doorbell just as Brandon was seeing Leah out. The boy stepped inside, his hands trembling but clutching an old phone tightly. Sir, this was on my mom's phone. I heard it already. I didn't want to, but I have to give it to you. Brandon motioned for him to sit. Ethan opened the recorder app and played a short clip. Sandra's voice whispered beneath the sound of a vent fan. Give the photo to Frank. Let the press explode. I want him out of this house. The sentence cut off, but it was enough. Brandon stopped the recording and looked at the boy longer than usual. Thank you. You were brave. Ethan nodded, his eyes glistening but clearly lighter. Please don't say it was me. Brandon nodded. I'll say the system recorded it. The boy exhaled in relief. Brandon forwarded the file to Lucy, with a note about the time and context. He also sent a copy of the police report from yesterday morning's inspection. The list of photos showing Emma's meals and sleeping corner, and a brief note from Leah about the progress of therapy. Everything went through email to create a clear trail. Jacob stood at the door, reporting that he had replaced all the gate codes and updated access rights. Night fell, and most of the lights in the house were off. Brandon passed through the living room. Emma was sitting curled up on the rug, staring at a box with the word door taped on it. Her voice was as thin as mist. Tomorrow. Do we have to leave? Brandon sat down at the edge of the rug, still leaving a small space so she could close the gap if she wanted. Tomorrow, we will go together. Emma stayed silent, her hand resting on the lid of the box, as if checking whether the letters were still sticking. The phone vibrated on the table, Lucy's email appearing like another knock at the door. Frank filed for emergency custody. Preliminary hearing. 9 a.m. Thursday. Brandon glanced at the time in the corner of the screen, then silenced the phone. He turned back, speaking just loud and slow enough. Tonight, we are still at home. Emma nodded, her lips moving again with the 3 words she had learned. Enough. Safe. Here. And somehow, the room exhaled in the same way. The next morning, Brandon took Emma to school earlier than usual. He stopped at the curb, adjusted the straps on her backpack, and spoke slowly so she could hear clearly. Go in with Miss Monroe. I'll be out in the yard. If you need anything, just call. Emma gave the faintest nod, her hand still clutching the edge of her backpack as if she were holding on to a breath. Sophie, sitting in the back seat, lowered the window slightly and waved. "Emma, I'll keep a seat for you on the ride back." Emma smiled softly and walked through the gate. The bell rang for class. Miss Karen Monroe handed each group a sheet of logic exercises. At the back of the classroom, a stranger sat in on the lesson, wearing a dark suit, his eyes cold and observant. Miss Monroe gave the class a brief introduction. "This is Mr. Alex Reynolds, a member of the District Education Board. He is here to observe how our class learns." Emma glanced quickly, then turned back to her desk. Her group included Olivia, a quiet girl who was often afraid of making mistakes. Emma slid the worksheet toward her. "You try first." "I'll wait." Olivia traced her pencil around a square, as if feeling her way, then placed a symbol in the wrong spot. The group exchanged looks and Olivia pulled her hand back. Emma didn't correct it right away. She simply touched the pencil tip to two squares in the middle of the page and asked in a very small voice, "What if we switch these two squares? What happens?" Olivia lifted her head, her lips curving into a faint smile as though she had just found a hidden path. Miss Monroe, standing nearby, didn't intervene. She simply noted something quickly in her observation log. At the end of class, Miss Monroe invited Emma to bring the group's work forward. "Mr." Reynolds frowned slightly when he saw Emma's solution branching into two options. Miss Monroe asked a simple but well-placed question. "Why did you make this change?" Emma looked down at the paper. "I wanted my way not to make anyone lose." The classroom fell silent for a beat. Then the sound of pencils moving filled the air. A few students went back to erase some of the slashes in their grading sections, as if trying out their own small experiment in fairness. During music period, Miss Delia Grant led the class into the piano room. She was a teacher around 40, her hair neatly pinned back, her voice warm and practical, often using 3-note exercises to measure sensitivity. "Each of you press any 3 notes," she said. "They don't have to sound nice, they just have to be yours." When it was Emma's turn, she chose 3 notes close together. From the back row came a small burst of laughter because it seemed too simple. Miss Grant smiled. 3 notes can also be a roof over your head." Emma looked at the keys as if at a half-open door, then added 2 more notes. The short phrase sounded like someone breathing slowly after a long day of rushing. Miss Grant nodded. "You've found your rhythm." At recess, Brandon sat on a stone bench near the yard. He didn't call Emma out, he only stayed where she could see him. Jordan ran over and spoke quickly. "Sir." Today Emma helped Olivia feel less scared. Brandon answered quietly, "Thank you for telling me." He stood when the bell rang for the next lesson, his eyes still watching closely enough, but never intruding on her space. After lunch, Miss Monroe received an invitation to attend a short internal meeting. Inside the conference room, Mr. Alex Reynolds leaned on his hand, his voice steady but firm. "No background records, no proper family sponsorship. I oppose adding her to the gifted class list." "Miss?" Monroe put down her notebook and looked straight at him. "We are assessing ability, not judging the past." Mr. Paul Montgomery, director of Northbridge Academy, arrived 1 minute late. A man around 60, with a relaxed posture and a deep voice that wasted no words. He opened the thin file. "The draft test shows very rare logic scores. I recommend placing her on the watch list, not making a final decision yet. We need time and more data." Mr. Reynolds shrugged but said nothing more. The door closed, and no one raised their voice. That afternoon, the sudden fire drill alarm went off. The high, urgent sound triggered panic. Emma covered her ears, her back pressed against the wall, her eyes empty. Miss Monroe signaled Jordan to move their classmates aside, then dialed Brandon. He arrived quickly in the hallway, but not in a rush, kneeling down at her level. He didn't hug her. He simply offered an open hand. "Look at my hand. 1, 2, 3. Breathe with me." Emma tried to focus, tears brimming at the edge, but her breathing slowly settled. When the alarm stopped, Miss Monroe whispered. It's okay now. Brandon nodded in thanks, without explaining to anyone else. He stepped back and let her lead the class to continue the fire safety drill as usual. Later in the afternoon, when they got home, Sophie placed a small white cardboard box on the table. You can keep anything you want in here. If you're afraid of losing it, we'll put your name on it. Emma picked up a pen, wrote the tiny word door, stuck it on the lid of the box, then placed it on the shelf near the window. Brandon watched her action, and he understood this was her way of keeping control without having to say much. Brandon's phone vibrated in his pocket. A message from an unsaved number appearing like a stain of ink. Tomorrow I'll take her back. I have papers. Get the money ready, or get ready to be humiliated. Brandon didn't reply. He immediately forwarded it to Lucy Graham with the word threat, and also sent it to Detective Alvarez, a man in his mid-40s, measured in character, specializing in domestic violence investigations. Alvarez responded briefly. Received. Save the evidence. Do not reply. That night, Emma sat on the windowsill, hugging her knees, staring out at the distant lights. She whispered as if speaking to herself. If tomorrow I have to go, can I take the door box with me? Brandon stood at the doorway, holding his distance so his answer wouldn't push her into a corner. If you go anywhere, I will go with you. But tomorrow, we are going to a place with long chairs and people in black coats who listen. Emma tilted her head, her eyes less tense. Like in the movies. Brandon shook his head, his voice low. Number. Like in real life. She placed her hand on the lid of the box, her fingers brushing the word door, as if touching a small switch. Then, tonight, I'll leave the box here. Brandon nodded. Yes, tonight leave it here. And the room suddenly grew lighter by one notch, as if the 3 notes from that morning had returned. Adding one more safe note for the whole family. The courthouse hallway was cold and bright. Lucy Graham stood adjusting Brandon's tie, her voice low but firm. You only answer what you're asked, nothing more, nothing less. Detective Alvarez approached, handing over a thin file folder. We have what you need. Messages, old photos, neighbors' statements. On the bench across, Frank Carter sat slumped, shirt wrinkled, eyes bloodshot, his hand clutching a crumpled sheet of paper. 2 rows behind, Rick Jansen leaned over, checking his watch, his fingertips tapping nervously. At the end of the hallway, Lily Knox stood pressed near a column, her recorder app open, not daring to step closer. Brandon knelt down to Emma's eye level. Are you okay? Emma hugged the box labeled door tightly to her chest and gave the faintest nod. Sophie tugged on Brandon's sleeve. Daddy, I can hold the box for her. Brandon looked at Emma. Do you want to give it to her? Emma drew a steady breath. Yes. She handed the box to Sophie, their hands touching for exactly 1 second before parting. The bell called them into session. The courtroom was neat, dark wood, the lighting not harsh. Judge Howard Howell, in his 60s, peered over his glasses, a man of few words and economical gestures. Frank's attorney rose first, holding up a copy of the birth certificate. My client is the biological father. We demand immediate custody. Lucy stood, her tone flat. We are not disputing paternity. We are proving direct danger to the child. Howell gave a brief nod, signaling Alvarez. Alvarez presented the file. Last year's medical report confirms repeated bruising. 2 neighbors verify hearing constant shouting, along with photos they took at the time. Here are message transcripts from Frank's number to Rick Jansen. Verbatim. How much for the girl? The courtroom held its breath. Frank's lawyer frowned, shuffling through the papers for a loophole, but could not respond at once. The side door opened. The clerk ushered Sandra Blake in. She inhaled sharply, trying to hold her composure. He locked the girl in the house. He wouldn't let her see anyone. Lucy raised her head, her words deliberate. Do you have proof? Sandra turned away, eyes evasive. I heard it. Lucy's voice softened, but stayed steady. A recording. A photo. A message. Do you have any? Sandra stayed silent, her throat moving but no sound coming out. The courtroom door opened again. Ethan Blake, 12, stepped inside, his hands shaking, his face pale, but his eyes unflinching. He looked at the judge, then directly at his mother. "I have a recording. Mom lied to take money from Mr. Frank." The air seemed to drain out of the room. Sandra staggered half a step, avoiding her son's eyes. Lips pressed tight until they turned white. Howell motioned for the clerk to receive the device, and the court technician connected it to the speakers. The recording played, short and clear. Sandra's whisper in the laundry room. "Give the photos to Frank. Let the press blow it up. I want her out of this house." Detective Alvarez glanced at an officer standing by the door and gave a small nod. "Escort Rick Jansen outside." They seized Rick's phone and opened the undeleted messages. On the screen, one line stood out clearly. "Grab her tonight. The new gate code is 1601. Given by the housekeeper." Rick turned back, his face pale. Sandra collapsed into her chair, no longer able to maintain composure. Howell looked at Emma, his expression visibly softening. "I want to speak to you alone for a minute. No recording." The clerk led Emma into a small room in the back. Before leaving, Emma turned to find Sophie. "If the box remains, the story remains." Sophie held the box tightly. "The box is still here." In the room, Howell did not sit behind the desk but beside her, keeping some distance. "Is there anything you'd like to say?" Emma looked down at her hands. "I don't want to go back. I'm afraid of the smoke." Howell did not ask, "What smoke?" He only wrote a short line and closed his notebook. They returned. Howell reviewed the papers one last time. His voice even. "No need to raise it. The court grants temporary guardianship to Brandon Ellis. A restraining order is issued against Frank Carter. An investigation is opened into Rick Jansen and Sandra Blake's role will be reviewed." Frank jumped up, ready to lunge, but two officers intercepted him, his wrists secured firmly. Lily lifted her camera slightly, then lowered it, her eyes narrowing as if she had seen enough. The session ended. The hallway erupted at once. Cameras flashed. Lily stepped forward, microphone out, her tone steady. "Mr. Ellis," one line for the evening news. Brandon stood tall, looking straight into the lens. "No child belongs to greed." Lily recorded it word for word. Uncut. Outside the courthouse, Brandon opened the car door. Sophie climbed into the front, setting the door box on her lap as if locking something in place. Emma got into the back, fastening her own seatbelt. She leaned gently against Sophie's shoulder, her eyes still red but her voice steady now. "The box is still here." Brandon sat at the wheel, glancing at the two girls through the mirror, saying nothing so that the words could echo. The phone buzzed in his jacket pocket. An email from Lucy. "Next step, permanent guardianship procedure. We'll need Dr. Leah's letter and the school's evaluation. I'll draft the framework." Brandon typed a single word. "Understood." Then silenced the ringer. He started the engine, his grip on the steering wheel firm but measured, his voice low and steady. "Let's go home." Emma answered softly, like letting out a single note. "Let's go home." That first night after the trial, the house was so quiet that even the faint crackle from the fireplace could be heard. Brandon sat on the rug, his back resting against the couch, with no television on, no music playing. Emma carried the door box closer, set it on her lap, opened the lid, and pulled out a small slip of paper. She wrote 2 words, then held it out to him with both hands. On the paper, "Dad." Brandon swallowed slowly, as if he needed a moment for his heart to catch up with the words. His voice came out hoarse, but clear. "I'm here." Emma reached into the box for another piece of paper, wrote carefully, then looked up. "Could I take your last name?" "Not now. Just someday." Brandon placed his hand gently on the lid of the box, not touching hers. keeping his tone steady. When you're ready. Emma nodded, closed the lid, pulled the box back toward her, then set it on the shelf instead of carrying it to bed as she had every night before. The next morning, an email from Mr. Paul Montgomery arrived for both Brandon and Miss Monroe, an invitation for Emma to join the gifted program, along with a request for a small project. After reading it, Brandon only gave Emma the lightest encouragement. Ask Miss Monroe about the project today. There's no rush. At school, miss? Monroe handed Emma a sheet with the assignment description. Pick a problem in class, and think of a way to solve it so the fewest kids are left behind. Emma studied the paper silently, then a few minutes later asked for a blank grid sheet. She drew 2 paths leading to the same answer, labeled them fast road and slow road, and wrote a short sentence beside them. Everyone has their own pace. In music class, Miss Delia Grant invited Emma to continue her Song for Yourself. She leaned close enough so only Emma could hear. Last time you had 5 notes. Today, try adding 2 more. As if opening a door from the inside. Emma set her hands on the keys, repeated the 5 familiar notes, then added 2 new ones, low and warm. The piece wasn't long, but everyone went silent, hearing a breath shift from tightness to softness. Miss Grant smiled. You know the way back. At lunch, Jordan waved her over. Sit here. Olivia and Mia set their trays down and opened their workbooks. Emma, show us the detour way. Emma didn't say much. She turned her notebook toward them, erased a diagonal mark softly, then asked, if we switch these 2 squares, what happens? Olivia tried again and got it right. Mia let out a burst of delighted laughter. Jordan leaned closer and whispered, when the fire alarm went off, I was so scared, but I remembered how you breathed. Emma smiled faintly. I'm still practicing too. That afternoon, Mr. Stewart from Child Protective Services arrived for his regular check. He was in his 50s, solid build, spoke little but with weight. Brandon invited him to sit in the living room, not leading him around the house. Ask what you need, or just observe. Emma chose a seat near the window, set the door box at her feet, and Sophie placed a cup of water within her sister's reach before stepping back. Mr. Stewart watched the scene, wrote a few lines, then put his pen away. This is all I need to see. He stood, shook Brandon's hand. Keep the rhythm, the rest is paperwork. Late in the afternoon, someone stood at the gate, holding his hat. It was Mr. Carl Voss, a parent who had once signed the petition in protest. He looked into the camera and spoke briefly. I was wrong. Brandon opened the gate just enough for the words to step inside, not for anything else. Thank you for saying that. The man nodded, turned away, his figure lighter than when he had arrived. That evening, Brandon's phone buzzed. Detective Alvarez texted, Rick Jansen has been arrested. Sandra is being questioned for her role as an accomplice. We'll update. Right after came a message from Ethan, sent from his aunt's phone number. I'm okay. Brandon replied immediately. You did something grown up. A moment later, the boy sent back a thumbs up icon, no words added. In the kitchen, Brandon washed the dishes. Sophie wiped the table. Emma organized the pencil box. No one mentioned the court, the gate, or the threats. They talked about which cake they would eat on Saturday. About the topic of a logic project. About how Jordan wanted to practice 3-beat breathing. When they went into the living room, Emma placed the door box on the shelf, looked at it for a moment, then turned away. Sophie dimmed the lamp and asked softly, What do you want to do tomorrow? Emma answered right away, as if she had already planned it. I want to teach you 3 notes. Sophie clapped lightly, her smile spilling out like a lamp being lit. That night, Emma took out from the box a small slip of paper with 2 words, Daddy, and placed it deep inside, as if putting a treasure in its rightful place. She no longer carried the box onto the sofa. She pulled up her blanket, turned toward the window, her eyes no longer strained. Brandon sat in the armchair, back relaxed. He did not raise his voice. He only said what needed to be said. "Go to sleep, sweetheart. Tonight our home is quiet." Later, Lucy called. "The court has approved the schedule for the long-term guardianship hearing, but Frank has a new lawyer. They'll try to drag this out and make noise. We'll prepare Dr. Leah's psychological report, the school's evaluation, and the daily care log." Brandon looked at Emma's drawing taped on the wall, a house with 2 windows. Inside were 3 small figures. He spoke slowly, as if driving a stake into the ground. "Noise is not the voice of our home." Lucy exhaled on the line. "I agree. Sleep now. Tomorrow we write." When he hung up, the living room held only the sound of the clock ticking steadily. Emma shifted, her eyes half closed, and whispered just loud enough for herself to hear. "Daddy is here," Brandon answered right away, without needing to think. "Daddy is here." On the shelf, the door box lay still. No longer a cradle of fear, but like a lock that had finally found its right key. And in that silence, one could hear a door inside the heart closing softly, so that another could open from within. 1 year later, the auditorium of Northbridge Academy lit up. Emma stood backstage, holding a sheet of paper for her speech, no longer trembling. Miss Karen Monroe leaned down to adjust the hair clip for her, speaking softly. "Breathe and speak with your own rhythm." In the front row, Brandon sat beside Sophie, both of them looking toward the stage. Mr. Paul Montgomery exchanged a few words with Mr. Stewart from the Child Protection Center, then gave the signal to begin. Emma walked up to the podium. She searched the audience for the 2 people in the front row. When she saw Brandon give the slightest nod, she opened her paper and spoke slowly, clearly, without embellishment. "I once thought a door was something others kept. Now I know a door can also open from within." She bowed her head, her hand loosening its grip on the edge of the paper. The hall fell silent for half a beat. Then a few people rose to their feet in applause. The clapping spread like waves, not loud, only warm. At the back of the room, Lily Knox leaned against the wall. She did not raise her phone, only jotted down a brief note. She flipped the page, crossed out an old headline, and wrote a new one. "A door opens from within." In the front row, Carla Monroe, the teacher's mother, clasped her hands together. She leaned over and whispered to her daughter, "I was wrong." Miss Monroe nodded, saying nothing more, her eyes glistening, yet at peace. Next, Mr. Stewart stepped up, his voice deep and steady. "The center is announcing an annual scholarship for homeless children. The fund is sponsored by a family, but the plaque will only read." He paused, looking down at the small bronze card, "From someone who once received a coat." The hall shifted very gently, as if someone had just pulled a blanket closer to their chest. Brandon did not stand. He only squeezed Sophie's hand and looked toward the little girl on stage. The ceremony ended. In the hallway, Paul Montgomery shook Brandon's hand. "That girl has music in her." Brandon answered simply, "She has her own rhythm." Miss Monroe gave Emma a quick hug, then stepped back to let her walk with her family. Lily passed by, nodding a greeting to Brandon. "Tonight's piece will be different," Brandon replied. "Thank you for listening." That evening, the house was quiet. On the living room rug, Sophie set up a chessboard, Emma sitting opposite with the white pieces. Brandon sat nearby, not as a referee, just letting them choose the rules. "Today you can move 2 spaces if you're afraid." Sophie pushed a pawn forward. Emma smiled, shaking her head. "I'm not afraid anymore." All 3 laughed softly. The sound of the pieces tapping against the wood was like 2 short notes joined together. Halfway through the chess game, Sophie rested her chin on her hand and whispered, "Are we having apple pie tomorrow?" Emma nodded. "With cinnamon." Brandon smiled. "With cinnamon." He looked at the 2 children, then at the room. The ordinary golden light he once feared because it exposed the emptiness. Now that light looked like a home. Emma placed her piece, then lifted her eyes to Brandon. She did not test. She did not hesitate. "Dad," the word came out slowly, not like an experiment, but like naming what had already happened. Brandon answered at once, quiet yet full. "Daughter." Two small words met in the middle of the chessboard. Before turning off the lights, Emma stood up and opened the box on the shelf. She pulled out an old scrap of white paper, sat down on the edge of the rug, added one more word, then placed it back inside. On the paper, "Home." She closed the lid, turned the box so that the word "door" faced the window. As if to remind herself that opening or closing it was always in her own hands, Brandon dimmed the hallway lights, leaving a single golden glow in the corner of the living room. Time to sleep. Sophie gathered the chess pieces. Emma folded the blanket neatly into a square. There were no fireworks, no declarations, only laughter mixed with steady breathing, the sound of chess pieces tapping lightly against wood, and the shuffle of children's slippers dragging softly across the rug. The three of them sat close enough to hear each other's heartbeat. On the shelf, the box lay still, no longer a cradle of fear, but a place that held a word written true, a word that would be read many more times. Home. The story ended with a roof over their heads, but it began with a coat being opened on a cold street. Brandon did not buy a miracle. He chose it by saying, "Children are not merchandise." By lifting a child up without taking away her dignity. And when justice spoke, the abuser was handcuffed, the trafficker was prosecuted, and the one who spread lies was held accountable. Good people do not need slogans, they need persistence. Then something unexpected happened. A little girl who once feared the dark stood on a lit stage, calling a man by the simplest two words in life. "Dad." Our message is very clear. The wicked will be punished. The good will be rewarded. But before the justice of a court, there is always the justice of the heart, to stop, to look into each other's eyes, and to say, "Tonight, I am here." What do you think about the way Brandon acted? If it were you, would you stop your car in the middle of the night? Which sentence in the story touched you the most? Have you ever been the one who needed help? Or the one who managed to reach out in time? And do you believe that a door can also be opened from within, as Emma said? I also want to ask you something very ordinary. Are you okay today? Do you need someone to listen to you? Leave us a note. Our team will read it and respond when we can. If this story touched you, share it with a friend who needs to feel warm again. Hit follow so you won't miss the next journeys of healing, because sometimes, on a very cold night, just a coat and a word to stay are enough to change a life's direction.